Hi, I'm Carrie Brayman, Director of the UB Gender Institute, and thank you for attending the second Feminist Research Alliance workshop that we're offering this semester. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Irus Braverman, Professor of Law and Adjunct Professor of Geography at UB, and her main interests lie in the interdisciplinary study of law, geography, and anthropology. She's conducted ethnographic research of illegal houses, trees, checkpoints, public toilets, and zoos. Born in Jerusalem, Braverman acquired a law degree and a master's in criminology from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She served as a public state prosecutor and as an environmental lawyer, both in Israel, and was also trained as a mediator and worked as a community organizer for environmental justice issues as a political activist. Braverman acquired her doctoral degree in law from the University of Toronto, and she's received numerous fellowships from the Humanities Institute at Cornell and one from Harvard. And most recently, Braverman was a visiting professor at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. She's also the author of 4 books. Her first book, House Demolitions in East Jerusalem, Illegality and Resistance, came out in 2006, and it focuses on the bureaucracy that fostered and facilitated the construction of discriminating urban landscapes in East Jerusalem. She's since published a number of other books, most recently on environmentalism, Zooland, The Institution of Captivity, that came out with Stanford in 2012, and then most recently, Wildlife, The Institution of Captivity, which came out by Stanford in 2015. And it's a fascinating book. I just finished reading it today, and it documents the management of endangered species that really unsettles our notion of what's natural and what's not, and also what's wild and what's captive. And today's work is a work in progress from a book manuscript that Braverman has just completed called Coral Whispers. Please join me in welcoming Professor Irus Braverman to the Gender Institute.
I'll just say this is a project I've been working on for the last about maybe 4 to 5 years, and I've interviewed about 100 coral scientists. The focus is on scientists, coral scientists, and how they deal with the changes in ecosystems and how those have been devastating their research subjects, who are corals. And it was, when I embarked on this project, it was 2013 maybe, and just as I was doing that, things started changing for the worse for corals. And so the last 4 to 5 years have actually been a really important moment in the world of coral scientists and also for the life of the corals themselves. And this book that I'm writing is documenting the transition and the debates within the scientific community about how to deal with these changes in this world that we are now in this era that we're now calling the Anthropocene, the era where humans have had more impact than ever before, somewhere around the last 250 years. This is an informal geological era. We can speak more about that later. So I will just say that for me, doing the research, there was a kind of watershed moment in the summer of 2016 when I went to the International Coral Reef Association meeting in Hawaii, and I remember very concretely, this was a meeting with thousands of participants, and it was, you know how it is in conferences, like it's just buzzing and there's like hundreds of sessions and you just go from one to another and you feel like a chicken without a head, right? And so this is the only image you could find from the conference that does not reflect how many people there were. But so I escaped at a certain point, and this is where, as usual, most realizations happen, and this is where mine happened too. I was wondering why I was so actually overwhelmed, more than usual in conferences, right? And so what I what I realized was that the extremes that I was witnessing when I was moving along and among the rooms of the conference were just almost unbearably bipolar, and I wanted to call it biopolar to kind of signify my use of biopolitics in the sense that Michel Foucault uses it. So this would be kind of more for the anthropologists and English people here in the room, but in the sense of how power is now oriented toward making life and differentiating between different forms of life. So I called it biopolarity, and what I was really astonished by is the extreme oscillation between the two sides of hope. On the one side, you go to one room and you hear all these narratives of restoration and assisted evolution and super corals, and I'm going to talk about these toward the end of my talk today. And then you go to another room and you hear about the Great Barrier Reef and the devastation and the projections and the monitoring, and you see red and catastrophe and extinction. So I just felt like the movement between hope, despair is something that was important to capture, to explain. And I think it's a very, I think it's not incidental that this is what I witnessed. And so I was able to witness it very strongly at the conference. And wondering how, okay, if I'm dealing with a hope, despair, like I actually experienced it myself personally, then how do the coral scientists deal with it in their everyday work? How can they manage to work within this polarity? So I'll just say a little bit about me. I started diving in 1989 in the Red Sea near where I grew up. And this is actually not a picture from then. The pictures from there are kind of a little bit more colorful. And so this was kind of during my 20s, kind of over 25 years ago. I'm not going to calculate exactly because my brain doesn't go that way. But basically, we're talking about over 20 years that have passed since I last was diving. And then as I was working on that book, Wildlife, which documents actually the erosion of the divide between the wild and captivity, and I look into different examples of that erosion. So people directed me to nurseries. So nurseries are where corals are propagated in the ocean, but they're propagated by humans. And so it was an interesting combination of, well, it's in the wild, in the ocean, but humans are intensively managing these corals. They're planting them there artificially, et cetera, et cetera. So it was an interesting example for me, but it was too complicated to include, and I don't even know if I even include the example in Wildlife. I promised the person who introduced me to it that I'd come back to Puerto Rico, to Vieques, to actually study it, and I did get a grant, and I did manage to go back, and thought it would be another example of the erosion of the divide, but it turned out to be a much larger project, because from there, so here's Wildlife. This is my then, I think she was 7 then, my daughter, and me diving, very hard field work. And so this is under the water in Vieques, Puerto Rico, where we were kind of looking, where coral scientist Edwin Hernando Delgado took us to show us the Acropora species that he transplanted from the nurseries into the degraded reefs. And the Caribbean in general have been degraded much before the Great Barrier Reef. So this, we're talking 70s and 80s, that sometimes 70, sometimes 80, sometimes 90% of coral reefs or reef-building corals died in the Caribbean. So this is Edwin and a graduate student who are fixing their nursery. I don't know, did I include it? I'll show you later what happened to the nurseries in Maria and Irma. I mean, I don't have a picture, but I have an email. So this is a close-up of the staghorn coral, the cervicornis, Acropora cervicornis, that they're propagating using ropes, if you can see, and sometimes actually tying them together with, I always forget the name of the floss, dental floss, right? It always escapes me that name. Right, so battling climate change and major, global changes with dental floss, I mean, I think it's a very kind of David and Goliath story, isn't it, right? And I constantly was asking myself, because actually the scientist got really upset when I asked him the question, so where are the corals? Like, he thought it was very rich in corals, which speaks to a different question about shifting baselines, etc. But I was just devastated, like, where are all the colorful corals that I saw when I was growing up and diving in the Red Sea? And so that kind of difference, although it was in different areas, and perhaps the Caribbean never looked like the Red Sea, but it seemed that something was happening, and I wanted to look into a little bit more closely what was happening to corals. So I asked Edwin to connect me to other scientists. He connected me to scientists working in the Great Barrier Reef. That was actually about 2 years ago when I went to Australia. That was like maybe 2015. And and when I was there, do I have pictures from there? Yeah, so this is the Great Barrier Reef. Again, so these corals, unfortunately, I was kind of reluctant to go to the Great Barrier Reef, believe it or not. I thought I was gonna be disappointed, and indeed it was very interesting to see the military operations of how one is being taken to dive in the Great Barrier Reef. But at this point, I was just reading today actually that this same reef is no longer how it is now. Now corals there are going through periods of basically becoming neon kind of corals, which means that they're in phasing toward bleaching and then toward dying. But we'll get there in a second. I'll explain a little bit about what happened in the Great Barrier Reef. So that's kind of the gloom and doom narrative, and then there are more and more voices, especially of women scientists, who call for more ocean optimism, and this from Nancy Knowlton: bleaching is bad, but giving up is worse. So what I'm going to do in the rest of the time I have, I'm going to look into, we're going to sway between hope, despair, and we'll end with hope. And then maybe we'll watch Netflix, which is going to take us back down to despair, because then that's going to just, yeah. So this is Sarah Frias Torres, and we communicated a lot via email and Skype until I met her at that conference I told you about. And it was really interesting to talk to her, because she is a very charismatic and passionate person. She used to just be working in the lab as a marine biologist, but when she said the movies with Cousteau and how the Mediterranean was, she's from Spain, and when she saw how the Mediterranean was changing, she decided she has to go into conservation, and not only conservation, she wants to go into restoration, which is a novel field in coral science, and some would say is not even science. And so Sarah is very passionate about restoration, and she works in this nursery she used to work in this nursery in Seychelles, where you see how she plants corals on these rope nurseries. And what I witnessed, the moment that I witnessed, I thought, again, a very important moment for me to realize what was going on and the tensions within the coral community. So this is what I heard her say. This is actually not an interview. I was witnessing her saying this in the room to a few hundred coral scientists, and this is what she was saying. I learned this from a pediatrician where she raised her hand in a Q&A, and she stood up and she said, I learned this from a pediatrician working in poor villages in South America. He said that in the emergency room, they don't have the resources to attend to all the babies and little children at once. When in a triage situation, they only help those babies that are crying. Because if they're crying, it means they're strong enough. They still have some life in them. That the medical treatment will be useful. For the babies that don't cry, there is no help. We are now in triage. We can only save the coral reefs that are still crying for help, because they still hold enough life that the conservation effort will be useful. What to do with the others? As a coral reef restoration scientist, I ask you, give us the rejects, give us the dead and the dying. We'll patch them up. Conservation and restoration should work together. In this way, coral reefs still have a chance at survival. So while this might seem to some of you just like as a non-provocative statement, like let's work together, let's collaborate, conservation, restoration, actually you could cut the air in the room at that point, like with a knife. I was astounded to sense how much tension there was. And this statement, as much pain as there was in it, was completely ignored. There was a few seconds of kind of uncomfortable silence, and then somebody raised their hand and asked about something else, and the conversation moved on. Which was fascinating as an anthropologist to kind of witness what is it here that the tension is all about. And it seems like, in addition to the fact that there is this division between hope and despair, this kind of maps onto a division between the more traditional schemes in conservation, which are oriented toward protection and preservation. So say, let's create a park and protect it. This is the more traditional way of thinking, right? Let's protect. Whereas the newer forms of conservation call for more intervention and call for even gardening. So humans, people say, have already intervened enough. And at this point, nature, it's hard for nature to help itself, and so we have to help. This is our responsibility. And so, so what we need to do is we have a responsibility now to come and tinker and intervene, and even like intense interventions. So this division between preservation narratives and between restoration narratives really splits the community into two. And interestingly, it's also split, I think, a lot based on gender, with the older, more traditional, and age, with the older, more traditional conservation, protection, usually held by the older guys who were kind of dominant in the coral science community, whereas the newer generations and the younger and the women seem to be oriented more toward, okay, narratives of hope, narratives of action and restoration. So I think it's an interesting mapping of different trajectories onto this division between hope and despair. And I'll talk about this some more, we'll flesh it out during this conversation. So, so just to say that the conservation folks, or conservation is kind of too broad, but let's say the more preservation folks, the more traditional ones that say let's not intervene, let's protect, they have a lot of contempt toward the restoration folks. And I even recorded, and the person wanted me to record and was very happy that I recorded, where he was basically saying that that he was upset that there were so many sessions about restoration at this international conference because this is crap, in his words. And this has been traditionally also a geographical distinction with scientists in the Caribbean, more oriented toward more restoration. We'll think about how early it happened in the Caribbean, whereas scientists in Australia usually oriented toward more protection, and the Great Barrier Reef being this kind of more protective mechanism, and the Marine Park Administration that evolved around that. Things have admittedly changed now, and even scientists in the Great Barrier Reef are now actually inviting restoration people, not yet nurseries, but gene banks and kind of those kind of intervention, to come in and help them record the diversity of corals before they are completely extinct, some of them. All right, so while all this debate is happening between restoration and conservation, Sarah goes and plants 42,000 corals in these nurseries, in 18 different nurseries in the Seychelles, and then successfully, despite a few storms, I think it was 20,000 that she replanted onto the reefs, and calls it a success because then fish and other communities come, and you can kind of start restoring the ecosystem. So this is one example where the restoration and the tinkering and the management. There are other examples of this kind of work, and this is an example for actually where humans intervene to control outbreaks of the crown of thorns starfish. So this is something that actually these animals were blamed for a lot of the devastation in the Great Barrier Reef before the great climate change impact of the recent 3 years. And because what people say is they suck the life out of corals, and now they're blooming because these are natural blooms. These are not invasive species, but and they've got periods of blooms, and apparently the latest blooming was a little bit more bloomful than anybody wanted it to be. So the government of Australia actually gave out licenses for divers to go in and inject the cuts, the crown of thorns starfish. They have a little acronym because, well, I can speak about more how they are dehumanized to go and kind of be able to go and kill them. And even sent out and gave support for the design of this robot to actually inject the crown of thorns starfish with lethal chemicals that can go and kill the robot without the intervention of humans. So here is a different management project. This is in the Caribbean, in Florida, and lionfish are called invasive, and they have altered the ecosystem in the Caribbean. And so here the Florida state actually gives money for every lionfish that is culled or killed, and restaurants serve lionfish meat, and so there's an incentive in order to again balance out what humans have done. So this is kind of another interventionist technique. I showed this image because it's the only one that I had of the reef behind me, actually. This is my daughter's first dive, and that's her, and this is, I guess that's me, and this is her. And behind us is an artificial coral reef called Tamar. This is in the Red Sea. This is 25 years after I used to dive there, and I went back last year, I think it was. And this reef that didn't exist before is now there because it's artificial. And the idea is that, well, humans have destroyed the natural reefs because they go and they kick and they don't know how to dive, and they destroy the reefs, and they put sun lotion that then, the chemicals destroy the reefs, and so let's just create artificial reefs, and we don't really care. We'll send those who are beginner divers, like my daughter, we'll send those there. They can kick the artificial reef, and we can just protect the natural reef. And actually, right now, those reefs, a lot of the natural reefs in the nature reserves in the Red Sea, in Eilat, are closed for the public. So I couldn't even access those reefs that I dived in. Well, I could, but the public can't. There's other incentives to propagate coral reefs. In a lot of hotels, there's this kind of ecotourism going on. Come visit. You can pay and then plant a coral, and even we will inscribe your name on the concrete, like at the basis of the coral, so it'll be there forever and ever, even probably longer than the coral can live. But coral nurseries and coral farms. The largest coral farms are actually in Indonesia, where corals are propagated for the hobbyist industry and for aquariums, and in huge numbers. This is in the Red Sea from a midwater rope nursery. So this is again for conservation and not for the trade, for the coral trade. And you saw this one from Seychelles. I do want to take a moment to reflect on these. These are trees, and they are underwater trees created by a conservation nonprofit called the Coral Restoration Foundation, based in Florida. Their director has invented this technique in order to, after many years of experimentation, in order to grow corals in a way that they will not get disease from the ground, they will not be wiped out during a hurricane, and they are being propagated and then transplanted onto the natural reefs, or degraded reefs, in order to basically restore those reefs. So he has 6 nurseries with about 500 what was it? Miranda, do you remember the numbers?
I don't remember the numbers. No.
I have them somewhere, but let's say thousands of, I could even say more than thousands, like even hundreds of thousands of coral, a lot of corals at this point. And every time he goes to NOAA for more like permits to put more corals in, and he has expanded recently to actually not just to Acropora species, but actually also to brain corals. And I was just talking to him on the phone this week, and he was very happy to say that this is what I saw on Facebook when I went on. Just after the hurricane came, and I was really nervous about what happened to the nurseries. And so there was this picture of one of the trees being on, and then there was a note right above it, like, if you see, please just take the corals and put them in the water. And I was like freaking out, okay, all these hundreds of thousands of corals are probably all dead, and we're going to hear more stories of devastation. But actually, I managed to speak to him this week, and he's been there for 2 weeks, and he said that only 3 of the trees were devastated, and those were ones that weren't connected properly, but otherwise they all withstood the hurricane, which is quite amazing. They did better than the natural reefs, and so the corals are still there, and they didn't really suffer much, and it was kind of a proof of concept, right? Like, now he knows that his trees can withstand hurricanes, which is what category 4 at that point, right? Hurricane. Another example of propagation of corals was here in the desert of the Arava, in the southern part of Israel, in the Negev, where it was just this surrealistic, most surrealistic interview I've probably ever had. We're walking in the desert and then seeing these farms of corals, like, being propagated there, and it's for the biomedical industry. So apparently corals their skeleton is very similar to our bones, and so they can be used for bone transplanting and for teeth and for knee transplantations in humans. So this is what he's growing these boutique corals for, and protecting them from each other, because corals are very territorial. They don't like touching each other so much. And I told you that Indonesia has the largest farms. We can talk about what that means later. And this is here at the Algae Lab here at SUNY with Mary Alice Koffrath, who is directing this lab. This is where she keeps her, probably the largest number of Symbiodinium species, which are the algae that grow in symbiosis with the corals, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that in a second. But I just wanted to let you know where corals and their symbiotic others exist, like in all these different locations, right? So this was kind of the hope side. Now we're going to move to despair and start talking a little bit about what a coral is. This is a brain coral, the second largest brain coral that we know about in the world. Think about that the polyps of each single coral could be about 1 to 3 millimeters, and think about how many polyps take to create this entire structure, and how many can take to create the entire structure of the Great Barrier Reef, which can be seen from outer space. How many coral polyps, each one of them being an animal, and how many colonies can create this huge mega structure that we can see. Actually, it's considered the largest organism on Earth, the Great Barrier Reef.
Where is that taken?
Gosh, I think in Indonesia. I'm not absolutely sure about that. I have to check that. So corals, they allow for this biodiversity of species, right? They are only 0.1% of the cover in the oceans, but they allow for 25% of the biodiversity in the oceans. So if corals go, fish go, or most of the fish go. If fish go, a lot of the communities that depend on the fish, and we're not talking about sushi restaurants in New York, but about islands that depend on fish for their protein, they go too. If corals go, also a lot of the protection of shores from storms, etc., go with them. And there's a lot of other lists of what happens if we lose the corals, which are both a group of species but also ecosystems, right? So they're the combination of both. So I wanted to kind of show a little bit, to explain what bleaching is, to show a little bit what a coral is. This is just one of the polyps. So this could be very tiny, and I'm sure that you can explain this a lot better than I can. Maybe we'll go into that a little later. But just to say that a coral is one of the prime examples of symbiosis, right, between animal and algae, but also bacteria and viruses, and what scientists now call the holobiont, right? So this is a combination of different organisms living together, and each helping this whole be successful and survive. So there are algae in the tentacles that you see there, and they are the chlorophylls are here where you can see, and they allow the animal to actually get more food through photosynthesis, right? So translating the light into food. And at night, the coral animal can send the tentacles and actually grab some plankton and other things. But this is how the majority of the food for the animal comes from the algae. And we are talking here, I should highlight this, only about reef-building corals. These are tropical corals. Deep-sea corals do not use photosynthesis and algae to live. They have different mechanisms. And so when we're talking about the decline of coral reefs, I'm focusing on tropical coral reefs. The whole story of deep-sea corals is just something that is unraveling right now. Not a lot of people work on it, not a lot of people know about it. I can talk about it a little bit because actually I'm really fascinated by corals that can live 10,000 meters down in the Mariana Trench. That's like with no light and nothing except for, okay, we can talk about it later. All right, so this is the tropical reef-building coral. And what happens when this relationship, this dependency has to break apart? What happens is what's called bleaching. So when the coral the animal gets stressed, or when it can happen for different reasons, diseases, but mainly for when the temperatures become a little higher. So it's like our body. If our body is with 1 degree Celsius higher, then how do we react? We can get a fever. We can feel bad. Coral reacts the same to very subtle differences in temperature. So the oceans have already warmed 0.9%, and so this is almost 1 degree, and corals have not been responding very well to this additional temperature. What they do is they expel, or I'm giving agency to the animal here, but what happens is, an algae person noticed.
Mary Alice and I talk about this a lot.
Yes, well,
the coral expelling the algae, or the algae escaping the coral.
Right, exactly. And actually, I'm for the algae here.
I think they're escaping. They're not.
Yes, whatever. That relationship is over, right? Well, it's not necessarily over. Some of them actually might be staying and could, or some of them might come back. And so bleaching, I will say, is not necessarily the death. I'll tell you what's here. Here there's nice, the chlorophylls are in here, and it's all nice. Now you can see that the algae is kind of leaving. Let's give the algae some agency here. And being left or leaving. And this is the situation of bleaching, where basically most of the algae is no longer there. Coral can no longer provide as much food for herself or himself, and is more susceptible to disease and to other threats to their lives, right? This is not death. Bleaching is not death. the symbiodinium, the algae, can come back or into the coral. Or some actually say that maybe corals can be injected with new symbiodinium that might actually make them more resilient. And we'll get to those ideas in a sec. But for the most part, bleaching does end up with death. This is how it looks like. This is bleaching. This is a bleached coral on the left. This is a dead coral on the right. How do we know it's dead?
No fish. No, the polyps are all gone.
Right. Polyps gone. What's the brown stuff?
Algae.
Algae. Algae takes over. Right. Algae has a bad rep in this story. Yeah. So this is like, okay, there's no more live polyps on the surface of the coral, right? Algae took over. These are bleached corals in Samoa, more. And here you see, this is a healthy coral, December 2014, dying February 2015, dead August 2015. So this is in a period of a year, of 18 months, this transition from healthy to dead. And about 1/3 of the corals of this huge organism, this huge structure called the Great Barrier Reef, has died in the period of the last bleaching event. Let me say something about bleaching. This is not something that people knew about until the 1980s, when it was first recorded on a local scale, that there is something like that that's called bleaching. And one of the scientists who kind of actually did his doctorate on bleaching, because he said nobody knew what it was. Why were the corals turning white? And this was in the 1980s. This is really recent, right? And since then, there started to actually be global bleaching events where corals bleach at the same time in a myriad locations. And there have been 3 global bleaching events. The third one, which was the longest and the most devastating, was the one that just ended in June. Started in 2014, just ended in June. And this is the one that also included the Great Barrier Reef. And actually, the parts of the Great Barrier Reef that were most protected and were most pristine were the ones that were damaged the most in this bleaching event. The southern part luckily got away with it because there was some kind of storm that came through and cooled down the water. So the southern part, which is the least managed and the least pristine, actually managed, fared better. This is how the media responded and kind of narrated the story of the death. So now we're in kind of the despair, right? So a catastrophe laid bare. More than 90% of the world's coral reefs will die by 2050. And then NOAA came out in June with this declaration that finally the great bleaching event, the global bleaching event, is over. And that was good news, right? Maybe corals will have some time to recover until the next great bleaching event. But then there was this article in Science that came out in June 2017 that of the 29 natural heritage sites that include corals, all of them, or maybe except for 1 or 2, are in a very bad state. So they were extremely damaged by bleaching. So that was the bad news, right? Like now kind of just documenting how much bleaching actually happened. And this was from an email in September after Maria and Irma came through, and I'm seeing that it cut the text, but it doesn't matter, it's so small, nobody can read it. But basically what Edwin, who I told you about at the beginning of the talk, so what he wrote, the coral list, was that it's all gone, all the nurseries, all gone, dead, everything. So all their boats, all their equipment, everything that they've worked for 15 years is all devastated. And we're talking Vieques Culebra, which has other nurseries, which is where actually you saw the pictures of them working under the water. They haven't even managed to get to Culebra. There is no connection with that small island of Puerto Rico. So that's a situation in the Caribbean right now. Now, if you want a little bit more despair, you can look at the maps here of the warming oceans in red. These are maps that are produced by the Coral Reef Watch. That is a little arm of NOAA that was created right after the first bleaching event, and they do monitoring projects all the time, and you can get emails if you want more despair in your life. You can get emails on a daily, weekly, monthly basis about your place of choice. I used to get them into my mailbox until I just couldn't handle it anymore, with alerts like, okay, this place is warming to degrees of like alert level 1, alert level 2. This is when corals stress for 1 degree higher than their highest temperature in the summer for over 4 weeks. That would mean that there's a high likelihood for bleaching. You get a warning, right? So this is the one from 27th of September. You can see the alert level 2, which is the highest, and then the red one is alert level 1. So how do scientists who have worked all their lives on these species, how do they respond? And Terry Hughes, who's kind of a major scientist in Australia, and probably one of the global experts on corals and climate change, says, I showed the results of the aerial surveys of bleaching to my students, and then we wept. So this kind of feeling of grief and being overwhelmed by grief was also narrated and reflected back from the Washington Post. Scientists say 93% of the Great Barrier Reef now bleached, and then we wept. All right, so if we had enough despair, let's move back to hope and end the presentation with hope. And this is with the emergence of genetics and genomics. And this is, I think it signals hope, and especially with the development of what is called assisted evolution. And I will talk a little bit about that. So for that purpose, we are moving to Hawaii, back to Hawaii, to speak a little bit, bless you, about ocean optimism, which is a term coined by Nancy Knowlton, who I showed you a quote from her before, because she said there's so many devastating stories about catastrophe, and people hear so like it's pounding on their head and they can't do anything about it. So what can they do? They just go to the bar, and that's it. So it's not a very action motivating narrative. And what she says is that we need to hear more about the success stories, and that there are success stories, and then that will help us be able to psychologically move toward a place of doing something, and not just kind of get overwhelmed by the trauma of the loss. This is Coconut Island, where I went to visit Professor Ruth Gates, who is the director of the marine biology lab there, and also president of the International Coral Reef Association. And I spent a day with her there, and she showed me around, and she's a very delightful spirit, very powerful woman, black belt in karate, and you don't mess with her, right? And she is also a geneticist, and what she's working on is assisted evolution. And I want to quote to explain what that means. The basis of our project is that we're assisting nature. We're accelerating natural processes. We're not creating anything new. We're doing what nature does and just trying to find ways to do it more quickly. I'm interested in who is performing well now. If we take the ones performing well now, can we lift their biology to perform even better? Can the best performers now become the best performers in the future? We're doing that through selective breeding, just classic selective breeding. We're interacting very hardy genotypes, and then we're going through conditioning, running our corals on environmental treadmills, with the idea that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So there's a combination of techniques that they're using in order to create what has been now more famously named supercorals. So the idea is that, well, either we can identify those supercorals in their natural habitats, like go to places where there's higher temperatures already, where the environments have already been degraded, but there are some corals who are surviving, and then we can pull them and see what exactly are their symbiodiniums. Usually the algae in the coral, the symbiodinium, is the one that allows the coral all these like strong forms of resilience. And so they identified which symbiodinium, I think it was C35, C15, this is like, all right. I went into all these details with with Ruth actually. And so how we can do that, or we can actually create those conditions in an artificial tank. And let's bring corals in and let's elevate the temperature. What they found out is that if we do that, then the coral next time will actually deal better with heightened temperature because it already acclimated. And so there's that technique as well. So trying to use different tanks and bringing up the temperatures and putting them on environmental treadmills, this is the idea. And then maybe introducing those supercorals into places that they wouldn't be able to get to naturally. So this is assisted evolution, right? So maybe they couldn't travel so quickly to cooler places, so we can assist them in getting there. So these are the combination of ideas, and Ruth feels very wary, I would say, toward the older traditional conservation who have been rejecting these techniques of genetic tinkering and assisted evolution. And she says about one scientist that she spoke with who was in the more traditional conservationist, and she said to him, I hate to be blunt, but you think that the restoration and assisted evolution need your blessing, and you know what? The reality is that you are so behind the fastball. Restoration is happening. Assisted evolution is happening. We are doing it, and guess what? If we don't, there are places that will have no reef left right now. Christmas Island has no, this is my daughter's favorite, goddamn, she's like, oh, goddamn corals left now. Are they going to wait for you to give them permission before they start doing these things? Absolutely not. So this, you can sense the urgency, and you can also sense the tensions between these coral scientists, all coming out of a position of care and love toward the corals, but taking very different stances. And I think I'm going to end with that, just highlighting that what I feel like I'm realizing is that, like, I'm trying to map this hope and despair and think about it more. And I've kind of recently put this, I felt like put it in these words. Okay, so tell me if it's helpful. So what I feel is that the scientists are dealing with a double-edged sword. So here it goes. All right, I just wrote it like today. So if humans can fix nature, like the interventionist approach applies, then why bother changing our ways, right? So this is the traditional conservationist speaking to the interventionist. Like if we can fix everything, then let's go party, and then we can fix it all. Okay. So on the other hand, if all is helpless and can't be fixed, and we're going down the drain, and climate change is happening, and it's all too global, and all these changes are happening at that scale that we can't impact as scientists. If it can't be fixed, then why bother doing anything anyway? Let's go party, right? So, so either way, it kind of seems to lend itself to inaction. Either it's too big, or we can do anything. There's kind of hubris, and so we don't have to go into action. So I guess what I'm sensing is that there needs to be some sort of balance. And this is how I phrased it. How can one work from a place of hope without losing sight of our limited power as humans? And how can one not fall into despair without exaggerating our power as humans? So I feel like a balance between those extremes needs to be sought when we think about conservation today. And looking into coral conservation, into the debates and the dilemmas of the coral community, will help all of us, not even those just working with corals or with non-humans, to understand what we're all going to deal with pretty soon. Thank you.